Ready to start, are we? I believe the next presentation is going to be understanding WSBA's regulatory functions. And again, Renata Garcia is going to be our presenter. Trying to get the screen up.
Technical difficulties. Give us a minute.
Technical difficulties.
Ananta, do you have it handy to send to me? Julie's looking too, but
Still not able to get to the screen share. Plan B. He's a pro.
Hanata, we're not hearing you in the
Hanata,
room.
we can't hear you.
Okay.
There we go.
Oh my goodness. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So I am causing all sorts of issues with my presentation. I was saying that I was also asked to present on regulatory functions. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's regulatory and how they can intersect with mandatory functions, because they're not the same. And I'm also but I'm not going to be covering what we are permitted but not mandated to do. So the next slide talks about regulation of the practice of law, right? So looking at GR 12. So I think anytime we are talking about regulation of the practice, I think it's important to start by noting that the Supreme Court has the exclusive power to regulate the legal profession, and the Bar Association operates under delegated authority of the Supreme Court in administering all those functions, right? Essentially, everything we do as it relates to the practice regulation is under the authority and supervision of the Supreme Court. And then the next slide talks about, so it's GR 12.1 that outlines the court's objectives in regulating the practice. The rule lists 10 objectives ranging from protection of the public, access to justice and legal information, and diversity and inclusion. So those are objectives that we need to keep in mind when performing those regulatory functions that we're going to talk about. The next slide, it's an overview of the primary. So if we can move this slide. Thank you. It's an overview of the primary regulatory functions, right? So if we look at everything we do, I would say that the primary things, programs and functions can be categorized into those 4 areas, right? So we have admissions, which includes reviewing applications, administering exams, working with volunteer boards like the Board of Bar Examiners, working with the law clerk program, reviewing applications for admission, and we have MCLE, not CLE, MCLE, reviewing compliance tracking for all the members, accreditation of courses submitted by sponsors, working with the MCLE board, and then of course licensing, the annual license renewal. We also have a part of licensing that's like membership records. So the same team, different functions, right? Part of it is the annual license renewal, and we also maintain the database, all the member records. That includes any status changes requests that we get throughout the year, member records, providing lists, ensuring that the courts have accurate, right, and up-to-date information of who has a license to practice law, and so they can check that. And of course, discipline, which is everything from intake, investigation, prosecution, to diversion, ethics school. So I'm going to come back to those functions. I do think it's important for us to take a moment to discuss how not everything that's mandatory is regulatory, and how the distinction is not always clear. So we can move to the next slide. Those are just an overview of what I spoke about. And then the next slide, so it's not always clear, right? There are functions and programs that fall into this gray area. So on the next slide, we are going to go over a couple of examples of things that are not clearly regulatory. And one of them is the client protection portion we talked about this morning, earlier, client protection fund. So the CPS assessment is mandated by the court, right? So it's clearly mandatory. People have to pay that in order to practice law in the state. Failure to pay the assessment could lead to administrative suspension. So there is a part of it that could be considered regulatory in nature, right? But it's not very clear. And I think that's mainly because the gifts itself, right? What the Client Protection Fund Board is reviewing and making those payments, that perhaps is not regulatory, right? So that's one area that's a little bit not as clear as the 4 that we talked about. The other area that's a little bit also gray area is the Supreme Court boards, right? So for example, the Access to Justice Board and the Practice of Law Board, they're not necessarily regulatory, but they are definitely mandatory. And then we have boards like the OOT board and the Limited Practice Board. So while they are also mandatory by court rule, they do play they do play a role in regulation of the practice. And one example of that, or maybe 2, they're involved in creating and grading the exams. They're used to determine who can become eligible to practice within those licenses, right? And the other example is discipline. So the Limited Practice Board and the OOT Board have a discipline committees. They're very involved in reviewing, for example, dismissals, or if something gets referred for investigation to the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, recommendations for a hearing, admonition, or even advisory letter. Those do get reviewed by the committee. So they play a regulatory role as well. One thing that I didn't include here, but we can talk about a little bit, another function that could be considered regulatory, depending on how you look at it, is proactive management regulation, right? So PMBR. So those are like approaches and programs used to prevent problems from happening, right? So rather than dealing with, for example, alleged misconduct and going through the discipline process, we are trying to prevent that from happening. So a very clear one, it's MCLE, right? Mandatory continuing legal education is there to ensure members are competent to practice law. So that's a clear example of a mandatory, right, like a proactive management regulation, but that's very clearly regulatory by court rule, and that's how we assess that function is regulatory. But things like, for example, ethics line, right, or practice management assistance programs, they are not necessarily regulatory, but they do play a role in preventing, right, someone from getting involved in discipline, for example. So it is a function that helps regulate to maintain competence to avoid misconduct. So that's another area that could be looked at a little bit more in detail and more discussions when reviewing, analyzing different structures and looking at options and where things would fall into place. The next slide, it's something you should all be very familiar with, the entity chart. So even though it's not always clear what's regulatory and what's mandatory, one thing that we do know, and it's very clear, is that the regulatory functions and the professional association functions are not connected in many ways, right? So I think that chart tries to illustrate that. It also shows our integrated structure, right? So like how we regulate the disciplinary functions, and it's all combined with activities that help benefit members and the profession and the public. So I think this chart is good to keep in mind. I think it could be tweaked a little bit, but I think it's a good thing to pay attention to and think about. Each bar association is unique. So even if you're looking just at mandatory bars, they do things differently, right? In many cases, disciplinary and licensing functions, for example, are administered by other agencies rather than the state bar. So that's not the case for us. And I think that's what this chart kind of illustrates. And it also covers the entities responsible or involved in those regulatory functions, right? Many of those entities are Supreme Court boards. And even though the chart doesn't really connect the regulatory functions with the board of directors, right, to the right, I think there are areas in which the BOG is either directly or indirectly involved in regulation. So I think the next chart, I can kind of demonstrate that a little bit. So perhaps this is the most useful slide for you to keep and refer back to. So we can look at each function, right? So I try to really call out the different roles, right? So staff, the BOG, and the volunteer boards, and obviously the Supreme Court. So if we go through the 4 main categories we talked about, so for example, discipline, right? So WSBA staff, they are receiving, reviewing, investigating grievances, recommending disciplinary action, dismissing, prosecuting, right? And the BOG, they don't have a direct role in discipline, right? Discipline is pretty insulated, but there is a very crucial indirect role, right? And that is to ensure sufficient resources are allocated to staff and all the volunteers to make sure that those functions can be performed. The BOG is also involved, of course, in appointments and nominations for the volunteer boards. So the volunteer boards for discipline, we are talking about entities like the hearing officers, the disciplinary board, and as I mentioned before, the OOT and limited practice board as well. And then with everything else we do, the Supreme Court, ultimately is the one that has exclusive authority over the entire disciplinary system, right? They conduct appellate review, they order suspension, disbarment, and interim suspensions. So ultimately, they would have to approve all of that. In terms of admissions, we are looking at, staff doing the day-to-day review of applications. We get about 2,400 applications for admission a year. Not all of those are bar exam applicants. We get a lot of motion applicants, UB transfer. We also do house counsel, foreign law consultants, and the Rule 9 license. And in terms of involvement in admission, which is a very clear regulatory function, there is a little bit of a direct influence, right? In addition to ensuring that we have necessary administrative resources to fulfill our obligations, the BOG also adopts admission policies, including setting the fees and deadlines for applications. And of course, the BOG oversees the law clerk program. And in terms of other volunteer boards, we work with several of them for the purpose of admission. We work with the Board of Bar Examiners. They grade the written portion of the exam. They prepare the Washington law component, which is the online portion of the exam based on Washington law. We also work with the OOT board and the limited practice board, like I mentioned, to create the examinations and to grade them. We work with the character and fitness board, right, to conduct hearings regarding character and fitness issues, and the law clerk board in making sure that those on the program get the support they need, and we are ensuring they're complying with the rules and tracking their progress throughout the program. And then, of course, ultimately, the Supreme Court is the one that can admit and license people to practice law in this state. So we submit recommendations to the court, and they actually have to enter an order admitting. That comes back to us. We issue the bar number and welcome people to the practice. So that's the process. In terms of MCLE, another mandatory function and regulatory function, we accredited educational activities, right? And we also ensure compliance of members. They're due to report. We usually review 10,000 certifications a year. Because of double certification year, we had about 20,000, so double of that. The BOG provides the same level of support as before, ensuring administrative resources for conducting all of those functions. And we work with the MCLE board, which is the Supreme Court board, to ensure compliance and to, on accreditation matters. They also set policies. They review issues related to accreditation. They also review member petitions and requests for waivers of requirements. And they do conduct hearings and when needed, but ultimately the court is the one that can make final determinations as to whether someone, for example, would be administratively suspended for not complying with MCLE requirements. And then last but not least, licensing. Our annual license renewal process includes, processing for all the 41,000 members we have, right? Ensuring that everyone either complies with the requirements, and then for those that don't, we try to work with them, send reminders, and then ultimately it goes to the court for administrative suspension if it comes to that. We also, like I said before, maintain the database. Member contact information is very important to be up to date and accurate, right? So that is reflected on the member directory profile, which a lot of members of the public use. We also issue things like certificate of good standing. We provide mailing lists. We provide statistics. We issue bar cards. Change of status is a big part of what we do too. We process hardship petitions, issue payment plans, and then, like I said, the pre-suspension process. The BOG plays a very important role here, and that is, of course, to set the license fee, right? And the BOG also defines the status changes requirement. So to change from one status to another, and that's all in the bylaws. The BOG also adopts policies that impact licensing and membership records, things like hardship exemption and setting standards for waiving late fees, for example. But once again, the court ultimately is the one that has the authority to order someone administratively, to suspend someone for failure to comply with licensing requirements, and to reinstate the member back to active when they do become compliant. So, so I hope this chart is helpful to outline that, and combined with the entity chart, it can, provide a framework for reviewing other structures and seeing how things would fall into place. I think that's my last slide, maybe. I'm happy to take questions. I think the ultimate question, and I think it is important to talk about what's regulatory, what's mandatory, and how we actually get to do those functions on a day-to-day. But I think perhaps the important question here is what's germane, and I think that's something Julie's going to be covering this afternoon. But I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for our Chief Regulatory Counsel? Not seeing any hands up. Thank you so very much for that presentation.